What if Dexter's most iconic move is also its most medically ridiculous? The infamous neck injection. Because nothing screams cinematic suspense like a tranquilizer to the jugular delivered with surgical precision by a serial killer in a Henley shirt. The hit series Dexter has long leaned into this medical fantasy. But let's be clear, this trope has more to do with camera angles than credible pharmacology. No one in the real world injects people in the neck. Not doctors, not nurses, certainly not vigilant murderers with a code. Why? Because the neck is a congested tangle of critical anatomy: trachea, esophagus, carotid artery, jugular vein, cervical vertebrae, and blindly jabbing a syringe into it is a surefire way to hit something catastrophic. Unless, of course, the goal is dramatic tension and a nicely framed reaction shot. The notion that Dexter, or anyone, could sneak up on a moving target, reach around from behind, and flawlessly plunge a needle into a vein in the neck is medical science's version of a unicorn. Even trained professionals don't attempt this without ultrasound guidance. But television isn't here for anatomical accuracy. It's here for visuals. And the neck, unlike a clothed arm or a covered posterior, is conveniently exposed and camera-friendly. The result? A clean shot of the injection and the victim's ensuing collapse, all in one claustrophobic frame that evokes panic and helplessness. Visually effective, medically absurd. Then there's the sedative of choice, M99 or atorphine, a veterinary tranquilizer designed for large animals like elephants and rhinos, and lethal to humans in even tiny doses. The show likes to pretend Dexter tailors the dosage based on height and weight, as though that transforms it from a deadly opioid into a handy knockout drug. In reality, M99 doesn't render someone unconscious instantly. It would more likely cause a slow, disoriented high before respiratory arrest sets in. No one is waking up from it, certainly not with a whiff of smelling salts. And just when the pharmacological nonsense couldn't get more irritating, the Dexter New Blood revival doubled down. In one scene, Dexter hands his son Harrison a preloaded M99 syringe for protection. A moment so laughably careless, it's a wonder the character survived adolescence. According to the show's own logic, the dose would have been calibrated for a completely different victim. That either makes Harrison a murderer by accident, or Dexter a negligent pharmacist. Take your pick. So why does Dexter inject his victims in the neck? Simple. It's easy to film, emotionally visceral, and requires zero explanation to the audience. But let's not kid ourselves. The neck injection isn't grounded in science. It's grounded in screenwriting shortcuts and dramatic flair. In the end, it's all fiction. Stylish, suspenseful fiction with a complete disregard for pharmacodynamics and basic human anatomy. But hey, at least it looks cool. Dexter didn't just kill villains. He destroyed every woman who ever loved him, and Deborah was his final casualty. Dexter, television's most beloved serial killer with a code. After 8 seasons of blood slides, awkward socializing, and internal monologues, fans moved on to Dexter New Blood and Resurrection. But with the new settings of Iron Lake in New York, one glaring absence has cast a long shadow: Miami. Specifically, that iconic apartment, cold steel and warm lighting, the oddly cozy lair of a meticulous murderer. Naturally, some still cling to the hope that this slice of Dexter's past might make a reappearance. It won't. The apartment was on the market as he faked his death, presumably sold to someone far less knife-happy. Even if Dexter ever returned to Miami, the notion of reclaiming his old haunt is pure fantasy. Whatever sentimentality he had for that space drowned along with the lies he buried in it. Then there's the lingering question of inheritance. Astor and Cody, his stepchildren and closest semblance of family, seemed the natural heirs to that apartment. But, like many of Dexter's emotional responsibilities, that thread was quietly abandoned. No closure, no conversation, just another relationship left to rot in the Florida sun. Yet it's not just the architecture that haunts viewers, it's the ghosts of the living and the dead. Among them, Deborah Morgan. Her death isn't just a sad plot point, it's a gut-wrenching betrayal of a character who, unlike her brother, never got to choose her darkness. Rita's death was a shock, brutal, abrupt. Deborah's was a slow spiral into despair, loyalty weaponized against her. She uncovered Dexter's truth, unraveled at the edges, and still chose him. Again and again. That's not devotion, it's a tragedy.
And how was she repaid? Dumped into the ocean, swaddled in white linen like a martyr, sacrificed to the same abyss that swallowed his victims. It was poetic, yes, but also infuriating. The image lingers, not because it was beautiful, but because it was unforgivably final. Deborah, the one constant in Dexter's unraveling life, deserves so much more than a eulogy of silence and waves. Her ending stings because she was the moral spine, the one person who loved Dexter completely, even as she crumbled under the weight of that love. His fate was inevitable. Hers was collateral damage. Dexter always knew his code would consume him, but Deborah? She was just trying to keep him afloat and drowned for it. The emotional toll of Dexter isn't just in its plot twists or shock deaths. It's in the quieter, crueler decisions, those made by characters and those made by writers. The series asks viewers to watch a man destroy everything around him in the name of control, justice, or family. But in the end, it was Deborah who paid the highest price for a burden that was never hers to carry. So as New Blood and Resurrection move forward without the palm trees, without the apartment, and most damningly, without Deborah, the series isn't just missing a location, it's missing a soul. The Dexter New Blood writers broke their own lore and hoped you wouldn't notice. In the ever-expanding universe of Dexter, the revival series New Blood seems to have taken a rather casual approach to continuity, particularly when it comes to Angel Batista. His reappearance may have been meant as a nod to longtime fans, but instead, it plays like a clumsy reanimation of a character the writers clearly don't remember how to handle. Let's unpack the tangled mess they've made of Batista, a man who somehow manages to be both retired and fully active in law enforcement, and who possesses knowledge he should never have had in the first place. We begin with Batista casually dropping a line about a killer targeting rideshare drivers, remarking that it's straight out of the Bay Harbor Butcher's playbook. The problem? That so-called playbook was never publicly acknowledged. The official story, if anyone in the writer's room remembers, was that James Dokes was the Butcher, a lone vigilante with a taste for taking out Miami's worst. So where exactly did Batista, a man whose investigation was derailed by that convenient scapegoat, get his insider knowledge about the BHB's victim profile? But here comes the attempted logic leap. Batista had been involved in digging into the identities of the Butcher's victims, many of whom were revealed posthumously to be criminals themselves. The implication is that Batista, through sheer detective intuition, pieced together the vigilante motive. Yet that theory conveniently ignores the fact that the case was declared closed. Dokes was blamed. There was no further official acknowledgement of patterns, let alone a codified playbook. The public wasn't told, the department wasn't pursuing it, and Batista, however noble, should have been bound by the narrative his own agency sold to the world. Then there's the matter of his employment status, which seems to exist in quantum superposition. One moment he's retired, with a party to prove it. The next he's flashing his Miami Metro credentials in another state as if early retirement were just a long lunch break. We're told this is a personal project, a rogue mission driven by passion, justice, and presumably the lack of better hobbies. This would be a compelling arc if the show had the decency to acknowledge the legal and ethical implications of a former officer
using an outdated badge to insert himself into an active investigation across state lines. Instead, it's swept aside with a weak justification, la pasión for the job. Touching, really. For added inconsistency, we're meant to believe Batista changed his mind about retirement because of Maria LaGuerta's death. Fair enough, trauma can reignite purpose. But again, the writing offers no substantive follow-through. Unlike Lundy, who was brought back in Season 4 with intention and gravitas, Batista simply drifts back into duty. No reappointment, no explanation, just vibes. Ultimately, Batista's return isn't a character resurrection, it's a narrative convenience. A once thoughtful character is reduced to a walking plot device, inserted to lend gravitas and recognition without the writing discipline to justify his presence. His knowledge of the Bay Harbor butcher is inexplicable. His employment status is fluid. His actions border on impersonation. And all of this is supposed to be swallowed without question, wrapped in the nostalgia of a familiar face. So yes, Batista is hunting Dexter. But don't be fooled, he's not following a playbook. He's following a script that forgot what it wrote 10 years ago.
They want you to believe Harrison was just a normal kid, but the show's final seasons tell a very different story. By the end of Dexter's original run, young Harrison Morgan undergoes a sudden and suspicious transformation. From mute toddler prop to eerily articulate child philosopher. One moment, he's a set piece strapped into a stroller. The next, he's challenging his father's honesty and issuing carefully worded warnings about secrecy. Apparently, childhood trauma now comes with a side of advanced vocabulary and moral intuition. The shift is jarring. For much of the series, Harrison barely exists beyond serving as a reminder that Dexter once tried domesticity. His dialogue, when it exists, is minimal, more a sound effect than a character trait. Yet by Season 8, he's spouting complete thoughts and questioning his father's integrity over a missing toy. It's a developmental leap that would impress even the most optimistic child psychologist. Of course, part of the inconsistency can be blamed on behind-the-scenes logistics. Multiple child actors played Harrison, including a stint with identical twins, a common practice meant to work around strict labor laws and the limited attention span of toddlers. And in the world of television production, small children are less known for nuanced performances and more for their ability to sit still without crying. The result? Dialogue is kept to a minimum, not for narrative consistency, but for sheer sanity on set. This raises the inevitable question: is Harrison's sudden loquaciousness in Season 8, and his unnervingly perceptive demeanor in New Blood and Resurrection, a sign of deeper characterization? Or is it just a product of narrative convenience, slapped over logistical compromise? Are we meant to read into his behavior as indicative of some shadowy intelligence or moral complexity? Or are viewers simply projecting meaning onto a character who, for most of the original series, was little more than ambient noise? The most likely answer is disappointingly simple. When the writers needed Harrison to be silent background decor, he was. When they needed him to have opinions, suspicions, and psychological depth, he suddenly could recite them with clarity. Realistic child development didn't make the script meeting agenda. Consistency was sacrificed on the altar of plot momentum. So no, Harrison probably wasn't hiding some secret genius all along. He was just a convenient blank slate, occasionally upgraded when the story demanded it. Whether that makes him suspicious in New Blood, or simply a late-blooming narrative device, is a question best answered not in a therapist's office, but in the writer's room. Dexter New Blood doesn't just bend the law, it breaks it, burns the evidence, and calls it justice. There's a moment in Dexter New Blood where our favorite blood spatter analyst turned backwoods recluse quips to his therapist, "Aren't we supposed to be talking about my dreams or something?" A throwaway line perhaps, but one that seems to wink at a certain New Jersey mob boss who spent a good chunk of The Sopranos exploring the symbolism of ducks and the deeper meaning of his panic attacks.
It's almost too on the nose not to be a reference. After all, if there's a modern template for therapy on prestige TV, The Sopranos carved it in granite. Of course, Dexter's comment might simply be parroting the pop culture stereotype of therapy, the one where the couch is barely warm before the Freudian dream analysis begins. And who better than Tony Soprano to have turned that cliché into a weekly existential crisis? So, whether intentional homage or unconscious mimicry, the line manages to plant The Sopranos squarely in the audience's mind. Which is fitting, considering New Blood spends much of its time rummaging through the genre's attic, trying on old costumes and hoping they still fit. And then there's the matter of law enforcement. More specifically, the comically elastic interpretation of it that Dexter New Blood relies on to keep the plot lurching forward. Angela, the police chief/girlfriend, somehow ends up with evidence that would make any self-respecting judge break into laughter before throwing the warrant request in the shredder. A burned-down cabin, a suspiciously convenient anonymous note, and some strategically scattered screws. And yet, miraculously, it's enough to piece together a case. Not that Dexter helps. Why involve the legal system when you can play both CSI and executioner? This brings us to a larger legal question. Can evidence obtained illegally by a civilian be used by police? In the convoluted world of Dexter, the answer is a resounding, sure, why not? But reality is less forgiving. In general, if a private citizen stumbles upon evidence and wasn't directed to do so by law enforcement, that evidence can often be used. But the moment a civilian acts as an agent of the police, the rules change. Consent matters. Warrants matter. And yes, appearances matter. So when Dexter, a man with a badge-adjacent day job and a police chief for a girlfriend, starts finding evidence and handing it over, it's not exactly a clean chain of custody. One might call it suspicious. A judge would call it inadmissible. Informants and undercover cops operate under their own unique blend of legality and moral ambiguity. Informants are not typically considered reliable enough to stand alone in court, but their tips can open doors, assuming those doors were legally unlocked. Undercover cops still have to play by the rules, even when pretending not to. No one gets to skip the Constitution because they're on a mission. Which makes Dexter, once again, a legal anomaly. He's not an officer, yet he's closer to law enforcement than most. He's romantically involved with the chief. He has access, motive, and no official oversight. If this sounds like the setup to a mistrial, that's because it is. And then there's the anonymous note. Jim killed Matt. Hearsay dressed up as a smoking gun. On its own, it wouldn't earn a warrant, but combined with the screws found in the ashes of a conveniently torched cabin, it becomes part of Angela's case. Never mind that the fire, the note, and the discovery all point to a setup as much as a revelation. In any realistic courtroom, the defense would have a field day. Ultimately, Dexter New Blood seems less concerned with legal plausibility than with narrative expediency. Evidence appears when the writers need it, and due process disappears when it's inconvenient. The show flirts with prestige TV's obsession with moral ambiguity, but stumbles over its own need for vigilante heroics. It wants to be clever, meta, and brooding, but often ends up just legally dubious and narratively lazy. But hey, at least someone remembered to mention dreams. Tony Soprano would be proud. Deborah Morgan was a chaotic legend. So why does her rebooted version feel like an HR-approved tribute act? There's something undeniably satisfying about watching a franchise claw its way out of its grave and manage, against all odds, not to completely humiliate itself. Dexter New Blood Resurrection, for all its narrative potholes, managed exactly that. It delivered a season that felt, if not flawless, at least purposeful. Watching Dexter and Harrison evolve, two deeply broken men staggering through the long shadow of their blood-stained past, was a rare return to form. There was momentum, emotional stakes, and for once, actual consequences. Of course, this being Dexter, no good deed goes untainted. The writing still stumbles over itself trying to be clever. Characters are routinely undercooked, and the continuity holes are less blink and you'll miss it, and more drive a truck through it. But compared to the series' much maligned original finale, Resurrection felt practically Shakespearean. The reception was overwhelmingly positive, and deservedly so. It was one of the few weekly television experiences in recent years that didn't feel like a chore to keep up with. But now we find ourselves watching Dexter, Original Sin, and the magic is wearing thin. The most glaring offense? Deb. Or rather, this pale, sanitized imitation of her. In the original series, Deborah Morgan was a foul-mouthed, neurotic firecracker who managed to be both endearing and unhinged in the same breath. Stripped of that chaotic energy, the character becomes a hollow echo of what made her compelling to begin with. It's not homage, it's dilution. And while we're dissecting character assassination, let's talk about Hannah McKay, the supposedly pivotal figure in Harrison's formative years, who has been erased from memory with the efficiency of a government cover-up. She's dead, yes, but the lack of any meaningful reference to her, especially from Harrison himself, borders on narrative negligence. The show asks viewers to believe he was raised by this woman, yet he speaks of her as if she were a passing acquaintance. It's less a plot hole and more a black hole where character depth goes to die. Still, despite its many sins, the franchise remains magnetic. Even its spin-offs, flawed as they are, command loyalty. That alone speaks to the enduring brilliance of the core concept. A serial killer with a code, a conscience, and a disturbingly likable charm. As for the new crop of detectives trying to fill the void left by the likes of Dokes, Batista, and even Angela, well, let's just say some shoes are better left unfilled. Detective Wallace, for instance, appears to be less a character and more a collection of detective cliches loosely stitched together. The quirk of solving crimes to music might be an attempt at charm, but without any real personality or backstory, it reads more like a desperate attempt to make her memorable. She isn't. Unlike Angela, whose connection to the central mystery and emotional stake in the case gave her actions weight, Wallace floats through the narrative like a placeholder for better writing. To be fair, there are worse sins than bland detectives or underdeveloped grief. Like, say, ignoring the fact that Dexter, paranoid genius that he is, would absolutely have noticed someone tracking him via an unknown pair of AirPods. But fine, if we're nitpicking, then we might as well nitpick with flair. Ultimately, Dexter remains a franchise that thrives in spite of itself. It's a show that can both frustrate and enthrall, sometimes within the same episode. It stumbles, it backtracks, it forgets its own mythology, but when it works, it reminds us why we ever cared in the first place. They didn't end Dexter, they sabotaged him. It takes a special kind of storytelling malpractice to derail 8 seasons of carefully constructed character work in under an hour, but Dexter's Season 8 finale managed the feat with something bordering on reckless abandon. What should have been a poignant send-off for television's most likable blood-spatter analyst turned serial killer ended instead with flannel. And not just flannel, but emotional cowardice masquerading as character growth. Dexter Morgan, a man who spent years painstakingly developing something akin to a conscience, is gifted a rare chance at peace. An escape to Argentina with his son Harrison and Hannah, his oddly stable love interest who, inconveniently, is also a poisoner. Yet instead of seizing this moment of redemption, he vanishes into the woods to become a bearded lumberjack. Because nothing says complex moral resolution like chopping wood in isolation while abandoning your child and partner on a different continent. The showrunners would have us believe this is Dexter finally accepting his curse, that he destroys everything he touches. But this philosophical cop-out is flimsy at best. Dexter had long accepted his inner darkness. The final season should have seen him evolve, not regress into a walking cliché of man pain.
Killing Saxon and boarding that plane wouldn't have been a fairy tale ending. It would have been the logical next step in a story about a man trying and finally managing to outrun his demons. And then there's Deborah Morgan. The decision to kill her off serves no functional purpose beyond piling yet more trauma onto Dexter's already overstuffed psychological baggage. Deb's death didn't propel the plot, deepen a theme, or offer closure. It was misery for misery's sake, a tragically unearned end for a character who spent 8 seasons grounding the show with her messy, foul-mouthed humanity. Therein lies the central failure of Dexter's original ending. It confuses bleakness with depth. Rather than confront Dexter's moral duality in a meaningful way, the finale opts for a vague, brooding non-conclusion. The hurricane sequence, the conveniently faked death, the solitary cabin, it all reeks of a writer's room unwilling to commit to either redemption or damnation. What makes this collapse especially frustrating is that Dexter was never just a show about a serial killer. It was a meditation on identity, morality, and the line between justice and revenge. Dexter wasn't good in the traditional sense, but he was trying. That tension between monster and man was the soul of the series. The finale snuffs it out in favor of ambiguity that doesn't challenge so much as it evades. Thankfully, follow-up content like New Blood at least attempts to mop up the mess. While its own ending drew mixed reactions, and, in typical franchise fashion, has already been partially retconned, it offered some form of narrative consequence, a concept the original series finale seemed allergic to. Original Sin, the upcoming prequel, might further redeem the franchise by exploring the early shaping of Dexter, Deb, and Harry. One can only hope it remembers that viewers aren't just bloodthirsty, they're emotionally invested. The tragedy of Dexter's ending isn't that it was sad, it's that it was cowardly. Rather than confront the character's arc head-on, it ducked out behind a beard and a metaphorical axe. Fans deserved better. Dexter deserved better. Even the lumberjack didn't deserve to be dragged into this mess. Dexter didn't kill Deb, the writers did, and they planned it from episode 1. Rewatching Dexter Season 7 is less a nostalgic trip and more a slow, inevitable march toward devastation, particularly for Deborah Morgan. The foreshadowing is so heavy-handed, it's practically scripted in neon. In the very first episode, Harry warns Dexter that revealing his dark passenger to Deb would destroy her. Moments later, Dexter is dumping a body off his boat, eerily mirroring the fate he metaphorically deals Deborah by the end of Season 8. Subtlety was clearly not invited to the writer's room. Deb's descent is already taking shape. By the time Sal is killed, she's too emotionally bludgeoned to even register it. Loss has become background noise. Gone is the fierce, volatile detective who once felt every death like a gut punch. In her place stands a woman so numbed by emotional overload and moral ambiguity that grief barely registers. The heartbreak is cumulative, death by 1,000 narrative cuts. Season 7 is often remembered with disdain, largely due to the Dexter and Deb dynamic, which tested the limits of both plausibility and viewer tolerance. But on re-examination, it's less overtly offensive and more tragically calculated. The showrunners, clearly starved for fresh conflict after 6 seasons, decided to fracture the most solid relationship in the series. Was it unnecessary? Arguably. But dramatically effective? Painfully so. Ray Stevenson's turn as Isaac Serco is one of the few high points. Finally, a villain with depth, menace, and charisma, a welcome reprieve from the increasingly cartoonish antagonists of previous seasons. He brings gravitas to a show that often forgets it's supposed to be about the complexity of human darkness, not just body bags and blood slides. Then there's Hannah McKay, the fandom's favorite punching bag. Apparently, being a layered, intelligent woman with questionable morals makes her irredeemable in a world where Dexter's literal trail of corpses is somehow forgivable. She's a compelling counterpart for Dexter, flawed, calculating, and refreshingly self-aware. Unlike Rita, whose character was flattened into a repetitive loop of "Where were you?" and "What are you hiding?" Hannah at least challenges Dexter instead of nagging him into corners. In hindsight, the seeds of Deb's undoing weren't planted in Season 8. They were sown right here. The writers didn't just hint at her collapse, they choreographed it. The tragedy wasn't sudden, it was deliberate. And that makes it all the more cruel. Subscribe for more videos.